Alexis Gold picked up the entire top tier of the wedding cake. Both hands, white frosting, smearing her diamond rings, and drove it straight into Chris Miller's face. Not a flick, not a smear. A full two-handed shove like she was trying to push him through the wall. The ballroom erupted. Her father laughed so hard he spilled his champagne. Her mother actually applauded. And Chris, quiet, still frosting dripping off his chin, said absolutely nothing. Just reached up, wiped his eyes clear, and looked at Alexis Gold, the way a man looks at something he's already decided to bury. What happened next didn't just end a deal. It ended a dynasty. Wherever you're watching from tonight, drop your city in the comments. Let me know how far this story has traveled. And if you're new here, subscribe and hit that bell. You will not want to miss a single second of what comes next. The invitation had been sitting on Chris Miller's kitchen counter for 11 days. He'd moved it twice, once to make room for Emma's science project, once to wipe down a grape juice spill, but he hadn't thrown it away. That was the closest thing to consideration he'd given it. A cream-colored envelope with gold-embossed lettering, the kind that announced its own importance before you even broke the seal. The Wexley Foundation Annual Gala. Black tie. Benefactors and partners. Welcome. His business partner Ray Dunbar had called 4 times about it. Chris, listen to me. Ray had a voice built for urgency, low and fast, the kind that made ordinary things sound like emergencies. This is not optional. Theodore Wexley personally requested your presence. Personally. Do you understand what that means? It means he wants something? Chris had said, pouring Emma's cereal into her bowl, the phone wedged between his ear and his shoulder. It means he's willing to finalize the distribution agreement. $800 million, Chris. $800 million. I know what the number is, Ray. Then act like it. Ray had paused, and Chris could hear him choosing his next words carefully. Look, I know these events aren't your thing. I know you'd rather be home. But this deal would change everything for the company. For your team. For Emma's future. Just show up, shake some hands, smile at some rich people for 3 hours, and come home. That's all I'm asking. Chris had looked down at his daughter. Emma was 7 with her mother's eyes and her mother's way of tilting her head when she was thinking hard about something. She was reading the back of the cereal box with absolute concentration, like it contained the secrets of the universe. Daddy has to go to a party, he'd told her later that evening. Emma had looked up. What kind of party? The boring kind, where people wear uncomfortable clothes and talk about money. She'd considered that. Do they have cake? Probably. Can you bring me some? He'd smiled, the real kind, the one that started in his chest and worked its way up. Yeah, baby, I'll bring you some cake. That was 11 days ago. Now he was standing in the lobby of the Grand Meridian Hotel, and the world around him was operating at a frequency he'd never quite tuned into. The Grand Meridian was the kind of building that wanted you to feel small. 40-foot ceilings, marble floors that reflected the chandeliers above so precisely that it looked like you were walking on the surface of a frozen lake made of light. Women in floor-length gowns moved through the space like ships in a harbor, slow, deliberate, aware of being watched. Men in tuxedos clustered near the bar, drinks in hand, performing ease. Chris was wearing dark slacks, a white Oxford shirt, and a blazer he'd bought 3 years ago for a supplier dinner. Clean, pressed, nothing more. He'd looked at himself in the bathroom mirror before leaving the house, Emma watching from the doorway in her pajamas, her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. You look nice, Daddy, she'd said. I look like myself, he'd said. That's the same thing. He'd kissed the top of her head and told Mrs. Patterson next door to keep the lights on until 10. The Grand Meridian's ballroom was through a pair of 12-foot doors that were opened by 2 men in white gloves. Chris walked through and felt immediately the quiet shift that happens when someone who doesn't belong enters a room full of people who do. It wasn't loud. It wasn't hostile. It was something more subtle, the way eyes move, assess, categorize, and dismiss all in the span of 2 seconds. A woman near the entrance glanced at his blazer and then looked away. A man with silver cufflinks clocked his watch a plain Timex and turned back to his conversation without expression. Chris had experienced this before. It didn't bother him the way it once had. He found Ray near the far side of the room standing with two other men from the company, Marcus Webb, their head of logistics, and Derek Cho, who handled legal. Ray saw him coming and started moving forward immediately, the way a man does when he's been anxiously watching the door. "You made it," Ray said, gripping his hand. "You actually made it." "I said I would." "You've said you would to 4 different events in the past 2 years. This one's different." Ray studied him for a moment. "Different how?" Chris looked around the room slowly. Tables dressed in white linen, floral arrangements that probably cost more than his first car, a string quartet in the corner, 100 people who spent more on tonight's drinks than most families spent on groceries for a month. "Because I actually got in the car this time," he said. Ray laughed short, relieved, and handed him a glass of water from a passing tray. "Wexley's holding court over by the east wall. We'll approach in about 20 minutes after dinner's been served. Low pressure natural. We don't want to seem eager." "We are eager." "Exactly, so we don't want to seem it." Chris nodded. He was scanning the room the way he always did in unfamiliar environments, not with anxiety, but with the quiet attention of someone who'd learned early that information was more useful than assumption. He cataloged people, body language, who was listening and who was performing, who held power and who pretended to. That was when he saw her. Alexis Gold was 20 years old, and she had the particular confidence of someone who'd never once been told no, and had taken that silence as confirmation that the universe agreed with her. She was beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful, polished, precise, constructed. She stood near the center of the room with 2 other young women, a champagne flute in one hand, the other resting on her hip with the casual authority of someone who knew the room was watching. Her father, Theodore Wexley, the man whose name was on the invitation, stood 20 feet away, deep in conversation, with 2 older men in matching gray suits. Wexley was 62, built like a former athlete who'd let comfort do its work over the decades, silver-haired, square-jawed with the easy smile of a man accustomed to being agreed with. Chris made note of all of it, filed it, moved on. He didn't speak to Alexis Gold. He had no reason to. She was the CEO's daughter, which in rooms like this meant she existed primarily as decoration and social signaling. He turned to Marcus and fell into a quiet conversation about a shipping delay out of the Memphis warehouse. He didn't notice when Alexis's eyes found him, but Ray did. "Don't look now," Ray murmured. "But Wexley's daughter is staring at you like you just walked in wearing a Halloween costume." Chris didn't look. "Is she the one in the red dress?" "White. She's about 30 feet to your left." "Let her stare." "She's talking to her friends. They're laughing." "Ray?" "I'm just telling you. I know what she's doing. Leave it." Ray went quiet. But the thing about rooms like this was that they were small, no matter how big they were. Sound carried. Intent carried. And when Alexis Gold decided she wanted something to happen, she had a talent for making the space around her collapse. She appeared at his elbow 12 minutes later. Chris was standing near the edge of the room, a plate of hors d'oeuvres in one hand, talking with Derek about the distribution contract's liability clauses. He heard her before he saw her that particular tone, the one that comes pre-loaded with judgment. "Excuse me." Not a question, a summons. He turned. Up close, Alexis Gold was even more deliberate. Every detail of her appearance spoke the same language I cost more than you make. She looked him up and down, the blazer, the Timex, the sensible shoes, with an expression that wasn't quite disgust and wasn't quite amusement. Something in between. The face of someone who'd found exactly what they were looking for and was pleased to be proven right. "Are you the caterer?" she asked. Behind him, Derek went very still. Chris looked at her. His expression didn't change. "No," he said. "Parking valet." "No." She tilted her head, a small smile at the corners of her mouth. Then who are you? Because you're very clearly not dressed for this event. I'm dressed exactly the way I intended to be dressed, Chris said. His voice was even. Not defensive, not hostile. The tone of someone simply stating facts. Alexis blinked. She hadn't expected that the absolute absence of embarrassment. I'm sorry, she said, and she didn't sound sorry at all. But this is a black tie event. It says so on the invitation. I don't wear black tie. Well, she laughed, a light social sound, the kind designed to be overheard. That's certainly a choice. She looked past him at Ray, then at Marcus, then back at Chris. Are you one of my father's vendors? The word vendors landed the way she intended it to, just slightly below employees, just slightly above people who use the service entrance. I'm a guest, Chris said. Same as you. Guests at this level. Alexis said, her voice dropping to something that managed to be both casual and cutting. Tend to know what the dress code means. Chris looked at her for a moment. Just looked. The kind of look that doesn't perform anything, doesn't posture, doesn't react. The kind of look that simply sees. You must be Alexis, he said. That caught her off guard. You know who I am. Theodore Wexley's daughter. You run the foundation's social media. You studied communications at Baylor for 1 semester before switching to business management. He paused. Your father talks about you. Alexis stared at him. Something moved across her face, surprise, recalibration. Then the smile returned, sharpened. And who are you exactly? Chris Miller. She waited. When no title followed, no company name, no explanation, her smile settled into something almost pitying. Well, Chris, I hope you enjoy the evening. She glanced at his blazer one more time, the gesture so practiced it was almost choreography, then turned and walked back toward her friends. He watched her go. Then he turned back to Derek. Where were we? He said. Liability clauses, Derek said carefully. Right. Chris picked up his water glass. She indemnifies us for any third-party claims arising from the distribution process. Walk me through the language again. Dinner was served at 7:30. The tables were assigned, and by some architecture of event planning that Chris recognized as intentional, his table was adjacent to the Wexley family table. Close enough for conversation. Close enough to be observed. Theodore Wexley came to him before the first course was finished. He was different in person than in photographs. Warmer, more physically present, the kind of man whose handshake said something. He pulled out the chair beside Chris without asking and sat down, which was either rudeness or the ease of extreme authority. And with men like Wexley, the line between those two things was almost invisible. Chris Miller, Wexley said, and his voice had the deep, satisfied quality of someone completing a sentence they'd been composing for a while. I was starting to wonder if you were going to come tonight. I almost didn't, Chris said honestly. Wexley seemed to appreciate that. Man after my own heart. I hate these things, my wife insists. He leaned back, crossed his arms, studied Chris with the frank assessment of someone who'd spent 40 years reading people across negotiating tables. You're younger than I expected. You're exactly what I expected, Chris said. Wexley laughed, a real one, full and unguarded. Good answer. He flagged down a server, asked for club soda, turned back. I want to talk about the distribution agreement. That's why I'm here. My people say your logistics network is the best in the Midwest, that your cold chain infrastructure is 3 years ahead of anyone else operating at your scale. Your people are right. They also say you're difficult to pin down, that you don't return calls quickly, you don't do lunches, and you've passed on 2 previous opportunities to get in a room with me. That's also right. Wexley studied him. Why? Chris set down his fork. Because I don't need the deal, Mr. Wexley. You need the deal. That distinction matters to me before I walk into any room. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Wexley nodded a slow, deliberate movement that meant more than agreement. It meant respect. "Fair enough," he said. "Then let's talk like two men who both want something." "That I can do." They talked for 40 minutes through the main course and the better part of the dessert service. Wexley was sharp, direct, occasionally funny, and surprisingly candid about the pressure his board was putting on him to secure Midwest distribution before Q3. Chris listened more than he spoke. He answered questions directly and asked better ones. He felt the conversation moving toward something real, the kind of deal that came from actual alignment rather than ego or theater. He almost forgot where he was. That was when Alexis came back. She appeared at the edge of the conversation the way a match appears at the edge of a tablecloth quietly, and then not quietly at all. She'd been watching them from across the room, that much was clear. The smile she was wearing when she arrived was too bright, too sharp, the smile of someone building toward something. "Daddy." She put her hand on Theodore's arm. "Are you really going to spend the whole evening talking business?" "Just finishing up, sweetheart." Wexley turned back to Chris. "My daughter Alexis, have you—" "We've met," Chris said. Alexis's eyes moved to him. "Chris Miller," she said, drawing out the name like she was reading it off a list of things that didn't quite make the cut. "Daddy, did you know our guest doesn't believe in dress codes?" Wexley frowned the faintest confusion. "What?" "He showed up in—" She gestured at Chris's blazer. "This. I thought he was with the catering staff." The words were light, casual. She was performing for the surrounding tables. Chris realized the people who drifted closer during the conversation, wine glasses in hand, the social predators of rooms like this who fed on moments of embarrassment. Wexley looked at Chris. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not agreement with his daughter, but the uncomfortable neutrality of a man caught between a business relationship and a family dynamic. Chris looked at Alexis. "Your father and I were in the middle of something," he said. "And I'm interrupting," she said pleasantly. "I know, that's rather the point." She reached past him, a deliberate encroachment of space, and picked up a fork from the dessert plate that had just arrived. "I wanted to say something to you actually, about our little conversation earlier." "You don't need to." "No, I want to." She set the fork down, tilted her head. "I want to apologize." The table quieted. Chris watched her. "I was rude," Alexis said, her voice pitched perfectly earnest enough to seem genuine, loud enough to be heard. "I assumed you were staff and that wasn't kind of me. You're clearly a guest." The word landed with a gentle, surgical precision that made it worse than an insult. The italics were audible. "I hope there are no hard feelings." It was masterful in its way. An apology that wasn't. A performance of graciousness that underscored exactly what she'd said the first time in front of more witnesses. The kind of social move that left no fingerprints. Chris said, "No hard feelings." She smiled. "Good." She glanced at the dessert table. "Oh, they've brought out the cake. You should try it. It's from Maison Laurent. It's extraordinary." She looked at him with the particular warmth of someone who's just decided what happens next. "Actually, let me get you a piece. I insist." "I'm fine, thank you." "No, really. I insist." And that was the last thing she said before she walked to the dessert table, picked up a plate with the top tier of the evening's centerpiece cake, both hands deliberate, turned back toward the table and in front of 60 witnesses, 40 feet of ballroom, and her own father drove it directly into Chris Miller's face. The sound it made was soft. The frosting was cold. He felt that first the shock of the temperature before the comprehension arrived. It was in his eyes, his nose, the collar of his shirt. The room had gone instantly completely silent in the way that rooms do when something happens that no one quite knows how to process. Then Alexis Gold laughed. It started high and delighted the laugh of someone who'd gotten exactly the reaction they'd wanted, except that Chris Miller hadn't moved, hadn't flinched, hadn't made a sound. He was sitting perfectly still, both hands flat on the table, cake covering half his face, and his eyes, when he opened them, wiped them clear with one slow motion of his palm, were absolutely calm. Her mother laughed next. Diane Wexley, seated at the adjacent table, a woman in her late 50s with the preserved look of someone for whom appearance was a full-time occupation, pressed one hand to her chest and laughed the way people laugh at something they find privately satisfying but need to pretend is accidental. 3 other people at nearby tables laughed the nervous following kind. Theodore Wexley didn't laugh. He was on his feet, his face a complicated landscape of shock and calculation. But he didn't say anything either. Chris reached into his breast pocket, produced a folded handkerchief, began methodically to clean his face. Nobody spoke. He wiped his eyes first, then his nose, then his chin. He folded the handkerchief, set it on the table, and looked at Alexis Gold. She was still smiling, but something had shifted in it. She'd expected something embarrassment. Anger tears a stammered exit. She'd expected the moment to go the way moments like this always went in her experience, which was that the person who'd been humiliated tried to escape it, and in trying to escape it, confirmed everything. Chris Miller didn't try to escape anything. He stood up. He straightened his blazer. He looked at her with the same expression he'd had when she first walked up to him, not hostile, not wounded, not performing anything. Seeing her, simply completely seeing her. And then he turned and walked toward the front of the room where the microphone stand waited beside the podium. Alexis watched him. Where is he? Ray was already moving. Marcus, too. Derek stayed where he was watching. Chris reached the microphone. He didn't tap it, didn't clear his throat. He simply stood there until the room's attention completed its drift toward him, which took about 4 seconds because there was still cake on his collar, and that in this room was more commanding than any podium. He looked out at the ballroom. He found Theodore Wexley's face. And then he spoke. I came here tonight, Chris Miller said, to finalize a business arrangement worth $800 million. His voice carried easily unhurried, precise. The voice of a man who'd learned that volume was the performance of confidence, not confidence itself. I want everyone in this room to know that arrangement is no longer moving forward. The silence that followed was a different kind than before. This one had weight. The Wexley organization, Chris continued, has demonstrated tonight that it doesn't operate with the values my company requires in a partner. That's not a judgment. It's an observation. And in business, observations are the only currency that matters. He paused. Mr. Wexley. He looked directly at Theodore. Thank you for the invitation. I hope the rest of your evening is exactly what you intended. He set the microphone back in its stand. He walked toward the door. Behind him, the room remained so quiet that his footsteps on the marble floor were the only sound in the building. Steady, unhurried, the sound of a man who knew exactly where he was going and had decided some time ago that he wasn't in any rush to get there. The doors of the Grand Meridian closed behind Chris Miller with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. He didn't stop walking. The lobby was nearly empty, a few hotel staff near the concierge desk, a couple waiting for the elevator, a bellman moving luggage across the marble floor. Nobody in the lobby knew what had just happened 40 feet away behind those 12-foot doors. Nobody knew that a room full of the wealthiest people in the city had just gone silent because one man in a department store blazer had decided he was done. Chris pushed through the revolving door and stepped out into the night air. It was cool. Mid-October, that particular Midwest chill that arrived after sunset and meant business. He stood on the front steps of the Grand Meridian and breathed one long, slow breath, and then he took out his phone and called Mrs. Patterson. She answered on the second ring. Mr. Miller. Hey, Mrs. Patterson. How is she? Fast asleep? Has been since 8:30? You know how she is with that book. She reads 3 pages and she's gone. He smiled, Yeah, I know. He looked up at the sky, city-washed, starless, the orange-gray ceiling of a million lights. I'm heading home now. Shouldn't be more than 30 minutes. Take your time, Han. She's fine. He hung up and was reaching for his car keys when the revolving door behind him pushed open and Ray Dunbar came through it at something between a walk and a controlled panic. Chris? Ray's voice had dropped 3 registers from its event mode frequency. This was the real Ray, the one who showed up when things went sideways and the performance could stop. Chris, what just happened in there? You were standing 12 feet away. You saw what happened. I saw you cancel an $800 million deal in front of 60 witnesses. Ray moved around to face him, not blocking his path, but close enough that the conversation had to happen. I need you to explain to me what you were thinking. Chris looked at him. I was thinking that I didn't want to be in business with those people. Because of the girl. Because of what the girl did. And because of what her father didn't do. Ray was quiet for a moment. He ran a hand over his face, a gesture Chris recognized, the one that meant Ray was doing math in his head and didn't like the answer. He didn't laugh, Ray said finally. Wexley didn't laugh. He didn't stop it either. He was in shock. It happened fast. Ray. Chris's voice was quiet, patient, the same tone he used with Emma when she was arguing past the point where argument was useful. A man lets something like that happen at his own table and doesn't immediately stand up and say something that tells you everything about who he is and how he runs things. I don't need to wonder about it. I've got my answer. Ray stared at him. Then he exhaled long, heavy, the sound of a man releasing something he'd been holding too tight. The board is going to hear about this by morning. I know. They're going to have questions. I'll answer them. Chris. Ray stopped, started again. You understand that this isn't just about the money. Wexley has relationships. He knows people on 4 different boards that we deal with. If he decides to make this ugly, then it'll be ugly, Chris said simply, and we'll handle it. He looked at Ray directly. Did you think what she did was okay? Ray didn't answer immediately. Ray? No, Ray said. No, obviously not. It was... He shook his head. It was one of the most appalling things I've ever seen at a professional event. But... Then we agree, Chris said. We just have different tolerances for what comes after. He put a hand briefly on Ray's shoulder. Go back inside. Make sure Marcus and Derek are okay. I'll call you in the morning. He walked to his car. Ray stood on the steps and watched him go. Inside the Grand Meridian Ballroom, the silence had broken but barely. The room had fragmented into the small, urgent clusters that form when something no one expected has occurred, and everyone is trying to be the first person to understand it. Voices were low. Eyes kept moving toward the doors Chris had walked through, as if expecting him to come back, as if the story couldn't possibly be over. Theodore Wexley was standing at his table, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't know what to do with his hands. Diane Wexley had stopped laughing. She was seated now, her champagne glass set aside, watching her husband with an expression that was very carefully not the expression of a woman who understood she'd made a mistake. Alexis was standing where she'd been when Chris walked away, still at the edge of the dessert table, one hand resting on the white linen, the other at her side. The delight had drained out of her face completely. What was left wasn't guilt, exactly. It was something closer to the specific confusion of someone who'd played a move they'd played 100 times before and gotten a result they'd never seen. Gerald Fitch, the Wexley family's attorney, and a man who'd spent 30 years cleaning up after moments exactly like this one, materialized at Theodore's elbow. Theodore, Gerald said quietly. Not now, Gerald. Now is exactly when you need me. Gerald's voice was measured, careful, the voice of a man who billed by the hour and knew how fast hours could accumulate. What Miller just did publicly in front of witnesses constitutes a verbal termination of a letter of intent. Depending on how the preliminary agreement was structured, there may be... Gerald. Wexley turned to look at him. Is there a clause in our preliminary agreement that covers what my daughter just did? Gerald paused. No. Then we're not talking about the agreement right now. He turned back toward the room. His jaw was set, the muscle working along the side of his face. We're talking about something else. He walked to Alexis. She straightened when she saw him coming, the automatic posture of a daughter who'd grown up reading her father's moods from 50 feet away. She knew this walk. She'd seen it twice before in her life, and both times it had preceded conversations she'd spent years trying to forget. Daddy. Don't, he said. The word was quiet. It stopped her completely. Theodore Wexley stood in front of his daughter in the middle of his own charity gala, with 60 of his closest business relationships watching from their peripheral vision, and he looked at her for a long moment before he spoke again. Do you know who that man is? He said. Do you actually know? He's Chris Miller, Miller Cold Chain Solutions. He built the largest private refrigerated logistics network in the central United States from nothing. From nothing, Alexis. He started in a leased warehouse in Dayton when he was 26 years old, with 11 employees and 1 client. Wexley's voice was still quiet, still controlled, but there was something underneath it. Not anger, exactly, more like the pressure that builds before anger, when a man is still deciding what shape his response is going to take. I have been trying to get that man in a room with me for 14 months. 14 months, Alexis. Do you understand what that deal would have meant for our distribution capacity? Alexis's chin came up slightly. He showed up in a blazer, Daddy, to a black tie event. He didn't even bother to. You threw cake at him. The words landed flat. No inflection, no decoration, just the sentence sitting between them in all its actual weight. Alexis blinked. It was a joke. At a professional event, Wexley said. At my event, in front of a man whose partnership I have been trying to secure for over a year. He looked at her, and this time there was something tired in his expression underneath the anger. Something that went further back than tonight. What were you thinking? I was thinking he didn't belong here, she said. And to her credit, or perhaps to her failing, she said it without flinching because she still half believed it. Theodore Wexley looked at his daughter for a long moment. That, he said, is the problem. He walked away from her, across the room, toward the doors. Diane started to rise from her chair. Theodore, stay, he said, without turning around. He pushed through the ballroom doors alone. The lobby was quieter than the ballroom, and Theodore Wexley moved through it with the deliberate, controlled stride of a man who was not going to let anyone in this building see him rattled. He made it to the front door through the revolving exit onto the steps and stopped. The car Chris had driven was gone. Of course it was gone. He'd been standing in that ballroom for 7 minutes at least, and a man like Chris Miller didn't wait around to see if the world would apologize to him. That wasn't the kind of man he was. Theodore had known that from the first conversation, from the way Chris's assistant had told his own assistant that Mr. Miller would need the meeting agenda 3 days in advance and would not be available for calls after 6 in the evening, and that his schedule did not include lunches. He stood on the steps of the Grand Meridian in his tuxedo and looked at the place where the car had been. Gerald had followed him out. Of course Gerald had followed him out. He's gone, Theodore said. Yes. I need his number. We have it. But Theodore, Gerald paused, choosing. I'd recommend waiting until morning. Calling tonight reads as panic. Calling tonight reads as a man who takes accountability. It reads as both. In business, those two things are not mutually exclusive, and right now, you need to be careful about which one he hears. Theodore turned to look at Gerald. What would you do? Gerald considered the question with the seriousness he gave all questions that would eventually appear in billable hours. I would send a formal written communication tonight, so there's a timestamp. And I would call in the morning personally before 9, and I would not bring an attorney. And Alexis. Gerald was quiet. Gerald. I think that depends, Gerald said carefully, on whether you're calling to get the deal back or to apologize. Can't it be both? Men like Chris Miller tend to know the difference, Gerald said. So the answer to your question is, decide which one it actually is before you pick up the phone. Theodore looked back at the empty street. Both, he said quietly. It genuinely is both. Gerald nodded slowly. Then I'd lead with the one that doesn't cost you anything, and I'd mean it. The drive home took Chris 28 minutes. He knew every turn he'd made the drive from the downtown core to his neighborhood 1,000 times in every kind of weather and every kind of mood. But tonight the route felt different in some way he didn't immediately have language for. Not triumphant, not heavy. Something in between, or something entirely outside those categories. What he'd done tonight was real. The deal was gone. He understood that. $800 million of distribution volume, the kind of partnership that would have allowed him to expand into 3 new regional markets, to bring on 60 new employees, to build the Memphis facility he'd been designing in his head for 2 years. Gone. Because of one decision made in the span of 30 seconds, standing at a microphone in front of people who'd watched him get cake thrown in his face. He wasn't second-guessing it. That surprised him a little. He'd expected some part of himself to start the quiet, internal cross-examination that always followed large decisions, the version of himself that laid out the alternate outcomes, the paths not taken, the ways the moment could have been handled differently. That voice was usually reliable. Tonight it was quiet. He pulled into his driveway and sat in the car for a moment. The house was dark, except for the porch light Mrs. Patterson left on, and the soft glow of the nightlight in Emma's window, a small star-shaped thing that cast pale yellow light through the curtains. He'd bought it when she was 3, after a bad week of nightmares. She was 7 now, and she still wanted it on, and he'd never once suggested otherwise. He let himself in quietly. Thanked Mrs. Patterson, walked her to the door. She studied his face before she left. She was 63 and had seen enough of the world to read people by their posture, and she said, "You doing okay, hon?" "Yeah," he said. "I'm okay." "Your collar's got something white on it." "I know." He smiled. "Good night, Mrs. Patterson." She left. He locked the door. He stood in the kitchen for a moment in the quiet house. Put the kettle on, not because he wanted tea, but because the sound of it was familiar, grounding the ordinary domestic rhythm of his actual life. He loosened his collar, took the blazer off, and laid it across the back of a chair, and looked at the white frosting, still faintly visible on the fabric. He thought about Emma. "Can you bring me some cake?" He'd promised her cake. He almost laughed. He put his face in his hands, not in grief or defeat, but in the particular exhaustion of a man who has held himself very straight for a very long time, and can finally in his own kitchen let his shoulders drop. The laugh came up through his chest, slow and tired and real, and he let it. Then he heard the small sound from the hallway, the particular soft shuffle of small feet that meant Emma had heard the door. He straightened up, wiped his eyes, not from crying, just from the laugh, turned around. She was standing in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, the rabbit under one arm, her hair pushed sideways from sleep. She looked at him with the serious evaluating look that children have at 3 in the morning when they're not fully awake, but they know something is different. "Daddy." "Hey, baby, go back to bed." "You're home." "I am, come on." He crossed to her, crouched down. "How'd you get up without me hearing you?" "You were laughing," she said. "I heard you." He looked at her. "Yeah. Is it a good laugh or a sad one?" He thought about it. "Somewhere in the middle," he said honestly. "Maybe more good than sad." She considered this. Her eyes went to his collar. Children notice the things adults think they're hiding. "What's on your shirt?" "Cake," he said. Her eyes went wide. "You had cake." "Sort of." "Did you bring me some?" He pulled her into a hug. She folded against him easily, the rabbit wedged between them, her face pressed into his neck. He held her there in the kitchen, with the kettle starting to warm, and the star-shaped nightlight glowing at the end of the hall, and he thought about the ballroom, the marble floor, the 60 people watching the microphone, the walk out the door. "I didn't bring you any," he said into her hair. "I'm sorry." "It's okay," she said in the easy, total forgiveness way that children have. "Was it good?" He thought about Maison Laurent. The top tier of a centerpiece cake, cold frosting, 60 witnesses, absolute silence. "It was memorable," he said. She giggled, sleepy and uncomplicated, and he carried her back down the hall to her room and tucked her in and sat on the edge of her bed until she was breathing the deep, heavy way that meant she was completely gone. He looked at her in the faint starlight. He thought about the morning she was born, the way the world had reorganized itself around that event, the way every priority had reshuffled into a new order that felt for the first time like the right order. He thought about Sarah Emma's mother, the way she'd held her in the hospital and said, "She's got your hands." And she did. She still did. He thought about the 3 years since Sarah passed, the way the shape of grief had changed from something sharp to something that simply lived alongside everything else present, but no longer deafening. He thought about tonight, and he understood, sitting on the edge of his daughter's bed in the dark, that this was why the internal cross-examination wasn't running. He knew, in the way you know the things that matter most, that the version of himself who stayed in that ballroom, who absorbed the humiliation and smiled and made the deal anyway, that man would have been a stranger to the one who got up every morning and made his daughter's cereal and drove to soccer practice and kept the star-shaped light on because she still needed it. He could live without the deal. He could not live as that other man. He kissed Emma's forehead and went back to the kitchen and made his tea and sat at the kitchen table with his phone face down in front of him. And he stayed like that for a while, just breathing, just being in his own house, just being himself. When he finally turned the phone over, there were 14 missed calls. 3 from Ray, 1 from Marcus, 2 from Derek, 1 from a number he didn't recognize, but with a Chicago area code. And 8, he counted them twice. 8 from a number saved in his contacts under a name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in 3 years. Tom Greer. Tom Greer, who was the chairman of the company's board of directors. Tom Greer, who was 68 years old and had been retired for 4 years and only ever called when something required it. Tom Greer, who had known Chris's father, who had been at the hospital the night Emma was born, who had sat across from Chris at a kitchen table, very much like this one in the weeks after Sarah died, and not said anything useful, but had said it with enough consistency that it counted. 8 calls. Chris stared at the phone. Then he picked it up and dialed back. Tom answered on the first ring, which meant he'd been sitting there waiting. "I was about to drive over," Tom said. "It's 11:30, Tom." "I know what time it is. I've been trying to reach you for 2 hours." A pause. "Are you home?" "I'm home." "Emma okay?" "She's asleep." "Good." Tom exhaled. "Good. Okay." Another pause, longer this time. "You want to tell me what happened tonight?" "You already know what happened tonight." "I know the what. I want to know the why." Chris wrapped both hands around his tea mug. "Theodore Wexley's daughter threw cake in my face in front of the entire ballroom. Her mother laughed. Her father stood there. And I decided I didn't want to give $800 million of business to people who thought that was acceptable." The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that Chris started to think the call had dropped. "Tom." "I'm here," Tom said. "I'm just thinking." "About whether I made the right call." "No," Tom said. "About what I would have done if someone had done that to me." A pause. "Which I can tell you honestly is not what you did." "What would you have done?" "Probably something I'd have regretted," Tom said. "Or swallowed it, which I'd have regretted differently." He was quiet for a moment. "The board is going to want an emergency call, Chris. Monday morning at the latest. Alderman is already leaving messages." "I know. Wexley is connected to 3 of our secondary distribution contracts. If he decides to use that..." "I know, Tom. So you know it could get complicated. Yes. Another silence. Then Tom Greer, 68 years old, former chairman man who'd known Chris's father, said something that Chris hadn't expected. She really threw cake at you in front of everyone. Yes. And then laughed. Her mother applauded. The sound on the other end of the line quiet, disbelieving the compressed exhale of a man confronting something his experience hadn't prepared him for, lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then Tom said simply, "Okay. Okay. Okay. I'll handle the board. You handle the rest." A pause. "Get some sleep, son." Chris held the phone for a moment after Tom hung up. Then he set it down face up this time and looked at the ceiling of his kitchen, the small water stain near the light fixture he'd been meaning to fix for 8 months, the place where Emma had somehow gotten a marker scuff on the paint last summer. The ordinary, imperfect, completely familiar ceiling of the place where his actual life lived. He thought about what was coming in the morning. He thought about what he wasn't going to do, which was apologize or retreat or soften the edges of what he'd said into something easier for everyone else to digest. He wasn't going to call Theodore Wexley with a version of the truth that left room for renegotiation. He wasn't going to let Ray walk back the statement in the press. He wasn't going to pretend for the convenience of $800 million that the past 3 hours had been anything other than what they were. He finished his tea. He turned off the kitchen light. And before he went to bed, he stopped in the hallway and looked through Emma's door at the star-shaped nightlight, still glowing small and yellow and steady in the dark. That's the same thing she'd said when he told her he looked like himself. He'd held that sentence for 11 days without knowing why. Now he did. The call from Theodore Wexley came at 8:47 in the morning. Chris was in the middle of making Emma's breakfast scrambled eggs the way she liked them, with a little too much butter and exactly no salt, because she'd decided 6 months ago that salt was too salty, when his phone buzzed on the counter and the name appeared on the screen. Not a number. A name. Which meant Wexley had called before, been saved to contacts, and was now using the direct line that Chris gave to almost no one. He turned the heat down on the eggs. He let it ring 3 times, not as a power move, just because he needed 3 seconds to decide how this conversation was going to go. Then he picked up. "Mr. Wexley." A pause on the other end. Not long, maybe 2 seconds, but the kind of pause that told Chris that Theodore Wexley had prepared for several opening responses, and Mr. Wexley, in that particular tone, hadn't been among them. "Chris." His voice was different from the night before. The warmth was still there, but it was quieter, more careful, sitting on top of something that might have been genuine discomfort. "I hope I'm not calling too early. I've been up since 6. "Of course." Another small pause. "I'd like to talk. Not about the deal about last night, about what happened." Chris slid the eggs off the burner. "All right." "I want to apologize," Wexley said. "Directly, without qualification. What Alexis did was indefensible, and the fact that it happened at my event at my table to a man I'd invited, that's on me. I should have said something immediately. I didn't, and I've been sitting with that all night." Chris was quiet. "You still there?" Wexley asked. "I'm here. I'm listening." "I don't expect you to reinstate the agreement. I'm not calling about that." Wexley's voice shifted slightly toward something less prepared, more raw. "I'm calling because I want you to know that what you saw last night, that's not who I've tried to be. And somewhere along the way with Alexis, He stopped. "She's 20 years old, and she's never once had to reckon with a consequence she couldn't charm her way out of. That's not her failure. That's mine." Chris leaned back against the kitchen counter. He looked at the eggs going cold in the pan. He thought about what Gerald had told Wexley the night before. Decide which one it actually is before you pick up the phone. And he thought that maybe this morning, Theodore Wexley had made the right decision. "I appreciate you calling," Chris said. "But," Wexley said, because he was a man who could hear the shape of what wasn't being said. "No, but. I mean it. It takes something to make this call. Chris picked up his coffee mug. I'm not going to pretend last night didn't happen. And I'm not in a position right now to revisit the agreement, not because of anger, but because I need my organization to see that the decisions I make mean something. If I reverse course in 24 hours, that message goes away. I understand that completely. But I'm also not someone who holds a door permanently shut. Chris paused. Time matters in this. What happens in the next few weeks matters. If your organization and your daughter demonstrate something different, then that's a different conversation. The silence on Wexley's end lasted long enough to be real. That's more than fair, he said quietly. More than I had a right to expect. You called, Chris said simply. That counted for something. After he hung up, he stood in the kitchen for a moment holding the phone. Then he called Emma for breakfast. The board call was Monday at 9. Ray had sent a summary email Sunday evening, 2 pages single, spaced the kind of document that was professionally calm on its surface and quietly panicked underneath. It outlined the potential exposure from the Wexley relationship, the 3 secondary distribution contracts that Wexley's network touched, and what Ray referred to carefully as the reputational implications of Mr. Miller's public statement. He'd also included at the bottom a single paragraph noting that the story had appeared in the Chicago Business Journal that morning. 4 sentences, factual neutral. Miller Cold Chain Solutions, CEO Chris Miller, publicly withdrew the company from an $800 million distribution agreement with Wexley Consolidated at a private event Saturday evening, citing professional conduct concerns. 4 sentences. By Sunday afternoon, it had been shared 1,200 times. Chris read the email twice, replied with 3 words. I'll be ready, and spent the rest of Sunday at the kitchen table, with Emma working on her book report about a dog who ran for president. Monday morning, he was in the conference room at 8:55, coffee in hand, jacket on. Ray and Derek were already there. Marcus came in at 8:59, with the specific expression of a man who'd been up since 5 and had opinions he hadn't decided whether to share. The board connected at 9 exactly. 7 faces on the screen. Tom Greer in the top left corner, the familiar square jaw and white hair, and the expression that gave nothing away. Richard Alderman, 61, third-generation money, the board's most reliably anxious voice in the center frame. The others arranged around them. Tom opened the call. Chris, good morning. Morning, Tom. I think we all know why we're here, Tom said. So let's skip the prologue. Richard, you had questions. Richard Alderman leaned forward immediately the way he always did when he'd rehearsed something. Chris, I want to be clear that nobody on this board is suggesting what happened Saturday was acceptable on the Wexley side. What that young woman did was wrong. I think we can all agree on that. Appreciate it, Chris said. But, Alderman laced his fingers together. The manner in which you responded publicly verbally at the event itself created exposure that a private withdrawal would not have. A phone call Monday morning, a letter through legal, those preserve the relationship, preserve optionality. What you did in that ballroom forecloses options. That was the intention, Chris said. Alderman blinked. I'm sorry. Foreclosing the option was the point. An organization that does business the way the Wexleys behaved Saturday night is not an organization I want optionality with. The public statement was deliberate. I needed our partners, our suppliers, and our employees to understand that we will not absorb that kind of treatment for the sake of a contract. You're talking about sending a message, Alderman said. I'm talking about having values that actually cost something when you exercise them, Chris said. Otherwise, they're not values, they're preferences. The silence on the call lasted several seconds. Tom Greer, who had said nothing yet, said, Continue. Chris set down his coffee. Here's what I believe is going to happen. The story is already circulating. By Wednesday, it'll be in 3 more publications. The narrative single-father professional event. Public humiliation principled response, that narrative is not going to hurt us. It's going to define us in a market where who do you trust with your supply chain is the first question every new client asks. He looked directly at the camera. We will have inbound calls by the end of this week from organizations that want to work with a company that operates with this kind of clarity. I'd stake my position on it. You may be doing exactly that, Alderman said. I know. Chris held his gaze on the camera, steady, unhurried. I'm comfortable with it. Another silence. Longer. Tom spoke. Anyone else? He looked around the frames. 2 board members who hadn't spoken shook their heads. A third said, I think Chris is right about the narrative. Alderman sat back, not conceding, just recalculating. All right, Tom said. Chris will revisit the Wexley exposure in 30 days. In the meantime, you have the board's confidence to proceed as you see fit. He paused. And for what it's worth, from the non-official part of this conversation, I'm glad you walked out of there. The call ended at 9:22. Ray exhaled so heavily it moved the papers on the desk in front of him. I cannot, Ray said, believe that worked. Which part? Marcus asked. Any of it, all of it. He looked at Chris. You were either completely right or completely crazy, and I genuinely still don't know which. Those aren't mutually exclusive, Derek said. Not helpful, Derek. Chris was already standing gathering his notes. We've got the Harrington contract review at 11. Let's be ready. He picked up his coffee cup. Ray. Ray looked up. Good summary email, Chris said. The panic was well organized. Ray stared at him. Was that a joke? Did you just make a joke? But Chris was already out the door. The Chicago Business Journal piece ran longer the next morning. 12 paragraphs. The reporter, a woman named Priya Anand, who covered Midwest business with a precision that made corporate communications departments nervous, had done her work. She'd gotten quotes from 3 attendees of the Wexley Gala, none of them named, all of them consistent. She'd gotten a comment from Wexley Consolidated's PR office. We regret any misunderstanding and remain committed to professional partnerships. She'd gotten nothing from Miller Cold Chain because Chris had told Ray they were saying nothing, and Ray had said, "Are you sure?" 4 times in a row before accepting it. But the paragraph that cut through everything else, the one that got screenshotted and shared and quoted, was the third one. According to multiple witnesses, Miller, a single father who lost his wife to cancer 3 years ago, approached the microphone calmly after the incident and delivered what one attendee described as the most composed thing I've ever seen a human being do. He then exited the building without another word. Chris read the article at his desk Tuesday morning once all the way through. Then he folded his laptop and called his logistics director and spent the next 2 hours talking about the Memphis facility projections. He didn't read the comments. He'd learned after Sarah that there was no nutritional value in other people's reactions to your grief, and the same principle applied to other people's reactions to your dignity. What they thought of what he'd done was theirs to think. It had nothing to do with whether he'd done the right thing. But Ray read the comments. Ray read all of them. 11,000 shares, Ray said, appearing in Chris's doorway Tuesday afternoon, his phone in his hand, and the expression of a man who'd been proven right about something he hadn't actually predicted. 11,000, the article, and we've got... He looked at his phone. 3 voicemails from companies I would have cold called for 2 years trying to get a meeting. Who? Ray read the names. Chris recognized 2 of them immediately: regional grocery chains, the kind of anchor clients that stabilized a logistics network, the way load-bearing walls stabilized a building. The third name he didn't recognize. Who's the third one? He asked. Pinnacle Health Systems, Ray said. Medical supply chain. They've been looking for a cold chain partner for their Midwest expansion for 14 months. He looked up from his phone. They said, and I'm quoting directly, "We saw the article. We want to talk to someone who does business the way your CEO apparently does." Chris was quiet for a moment. Set up the calls. Already done. Ray lowered the phone. He was looking at Chris with something that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite apology, the particular expression of a person who'd argued against something and was reconfiguring their position with as much grace as they could manage. "I was wrong," he said. "Saturday night, on the steps. I was wrong." "You were being careful," Chris said. "That's your job." "It was also wrong." Ray put the phone in his pocket. "I should have said something in that ballroom. When she walked up to you the first time, I should have—" He stopped. "I didn't, and I've been thinking about that since Saturday night." Chris looked at him. "You can't be responsible for other people's behavior, Ray." "No, but I can be responsible for mine." He said it simply, the way people say things that have cost them something to arrive at. "For what it's worth." "It's worth something," Chris said. Alexis Gold found out about the article the same way she found out about everything through her phone, through social media, through the particular ecosystem of information that surrounded 20-year-olds who'd grown up with the internet as their natural habitat. She was in her apartment, the one her father paid for in Lincoln Park, the one with the view of the park, and the kitchen she rarely used when her roommate, a woman named Jules, who studied graphic design and had the useful habit of saying exactly what she thought, came in, holding her own phone, and sat down on the couch across from her. "So," Jules said. Alexis looked up from her own screen. She'd already seen it. She'd been looking at it for 40 minutes, watching the share count move, reading the comments with the specific horror of someone watching a fire spread toward their house from a comfortable distance and then realizing the distance was no longer comfortable. "Don't," Alexis said. "I'm not saying anything. You're sitting like you're about to say something." "I'm sitting like someone who saw 11,000 people share an article about her roommate throwing cake at a man whose wife died of cancer." Jules set her phone down. "Lexi, I didn't know about his wife. Would it have changed anything?" Alexis opened her mouth, closed it. The honest answer was that she didn't know which was its own answer, and she was smart enough to understand that even if Jules wasn't pushing her toward it. "He showed up in a blazer," she said, and she heard as she said it how thin it sounded now, how completely inadequate as a reason for anything. "It was a black tie event. And so you threw cake at him." "It was—" She stopped. "I thought it would be funny." "Did he laugh?" The question sat in the room. Alexis looked at the window. She remembered Chris Miller's face, the way he'd looked at her after, with the frosting melting off his chin, and the total, unnerving absence of the reaction she'd expected. She'd wanted embarrassment or anger, or the flustered scramble of someone caught off guard. She'd gotten something else entirely. She'd gotten a man who looked at her the way you look at something you've already made a decision about. She'd been thinking about that look for 2 days. "He didn't laugh," she said. "No," Jules agreed. "He did not." Alexis put her phone face down on the cushion beside her. "My dad called me into his study Sunday morning," she said. "We talked for 2 hours. Jules waited. "He wasn't angry," Alexis said. "Or he was, but not the way he is when I do something that inconveniences him. He was—" She looked for the word. "Sad. He looked sad. He kept saying, 'I don't know where I went wrong with this.'" She stopped. "Which is a terrible thing to hear from your father." "Yeah," Jules said quietly. "I imagine it is. He talked about Chris Miller, about what he built, about the company, about—" She shook her head. "He said, 'That man started in a leased warehouse with 11 employees. He built everything you saw last night.' And I kept thinking about, I don't know, I kept thinking about what I've built, which is—" She laughed once briefly, the sound of it carrying no humor at all. "A very nice apartment. And 11,000 people who now know my name for the wrong reason." Jules was quiet. "I humiliated him," Alexis said. The word was harder to say out loud than she'd expected. Not because she hadn't thought it, but because saying it transformed it from a thought into a fact, and facts had a permanence that thoughts didn't. In front of everyone. And he just left. Like I was something he was done with. She looked at Jules. Nobody's ever done that to me. Ended a deal. Walked away, Alexis said. Without anger. Without anything. Like I wasn't worth anger. She was quiet for a moment. I think that's the part I can't stop thinking about. Not the article. Not my dad. The way he looked at me before he walked away. She picked up her phone, looked at the screen, set it down again. Like I was a version of something he'd already seen and already knew didn't matter. Jules leaned forward, elbows on knees. What are you going to do? I don't know. Yes, you do. You just don't know if you want to do it. Alexis looked at her. Don't do that thing where you're wise. It's not wisdom, it's just Lexi. You know what the right move is. He won't take my call. Maybe not. But that's not the point, and you know it. Jules stood up, picked up her phone, tucked it in her back pocket. The point isn't whether it works. The point is whether you become the person who tried or the person who didn't. She headed toward the kitchen. I'm making coffee. Do you want some? Alexis sat on the couch in her Lincoln Park apartment and listened to the sounds of the coffee maker starting up and thought about a man standing at a microphone with frosting on his face, speaking in a voice that didn't need to be loud because it was already certain, and she thought about what it must feel like to be that certain about who you are and what you're worth. She hadn't felt that certain about anything in a very long time. She picked up her phone. She opened her contacts. She found the number her father had given her that morning, the one he'd offered without pressure, without instruction, just slid across the kitchen table on a piece of paper and said, "What you do with this is up to you." She stared at the number. Then she put the phone down and went to get her coffee. She wasn't ready yet. But she was moving toward ready, and for the first time since Saturday night, that felt like something. Chris was in a meeting with the Pinnacle Health Systems team. Wednesday afternoon, 2 executives on a video call, smart direct, asking the right questions about cold chain integrity and temperature variance protocols, when his assistant knocked on the conference room window and held up a piece of paper. He glanced at it, read it, looked back at the screen. "Can you give me one moment?" he said to the Pinnacle executives. He stepped into the hallway. His assistant, a 29-year-old named Kara, who had been with the company 4 years and whose judgment he trusted completely, was holding a pink message slip in a way that suggested she wasn't sure whether to hand it over. "Someone called the main line," Kara said. "Asked for you by name. Said it was personal, not professional." She extended the slip. She left a number. Chris took it. The name at the top in Kara's neat printing, Alexis Gold. Below it a number. And below that in Kara's handwriting, the message word for word as it had been given. "Please tell him I'm not calling about the deal. I just want to say something I should have said in person. He doesn't have to call back." Chris stood in the hallway outside his conference room with the pink message slip in his hand. Through the window he could see the Pinnacle executives waiting patiently reviewing their notes. Through the other window, the one that faced the open floor of the office, he could see Ray at his desk. Marcus running a meeting at the whiteboard. Derek marking up a contract. His company. The one he'd built from a leased warehouse in Dayton. 11 employees. Now 240. The one that had gotten 11,000 shares in a news article this week, not because they'd signed a deal, but because they hadn't. He looked at the message slip. He put it in his jacket pocket. He went back into the conference room, sat down and said, "Sorry about that. You were asking about temperature variance in last mile delivery." And the meeting continued, but the slip stayed in his pocket all afternoon and twice. Once after the Pinnacle call ended, once during a quiet moment before he left for the day. He put his hand on it, felt the folded paper under his fingers, and made no decision except to wait. Some things needed to sit before you knew what to do with them. He'd learned that a long time ago. The message slip stayed in his jacket pocket for 3 days. He moved it once from the gray blazer he'd worn Wednesday to the navy one he put on Thursday morning, deliberately consciously, the way you move something you're not done thinking about but aren't ready to act on. By Friday, it had soft creases from being folded and unfolded, and he'd read it enough times that the words had stopped looking like words and started looking like a question he hadn't yet decided how to answer. Emma found it Saturday morning. She had a gift, the same one her mother had possessed, in a form so developed it used to make Chris feel transparent for finding things that weren't meant to be found. Not through snooping, just through being present in the particular way that children are present, which is to say, completely and without social filter. She'd climbed up on the kitchen chair to get her cereal from the top shelf and knocked his jacket off the back of the chair, and the slip had fallen out and landed face up on the kitchen floor. She picked it up, read it, handed it to him when he came in from the back porch. "Who's Alexis Gold?" she asked. Chris took the slip. "Someone I met at a work event." Emma watched him with those eyes. Sarah's eyes, the ones that held their ground, even when you wanted them to let something go. Is she nice? He thought about that for a moment genuinely, which wasn't what he'd intended to do. "Not the last time I saw her," he said honestly. Emma considered this with the moral seriousness of a 7-year-old. "Maybe she's trying to be better," she said, and went to get her cereal and said nothing else about it. Chris stood in his kitchen holding the message slip and thought that 7-year-olds occasionally said things that ended arguments he'd been having with himself for days. He called the number that afternoon. It rang 4 times, and he was constructing the logic of voicemail in his head, what he would say, whether he'd leave a message at all when she picked up. "Hello?" Her voice was different from the gala, smaller somehow, not in a way that seemed performed. "This is Chris Miller," he said. "You called my office." A silence, brief but loaded. "You actually called back." "I said I might." "You didn't say anything. You had your assistant tell me you got the message." "That's the same thing," he said, and heard the faint echo of Emma in his own words, and almost smiled. Another pause. He could hear her breathing slightly unsteady, the rhythm of someone who'd rehearsed something, and was now not sure the rehearsal applied. "I want to apologize," she said. "Not for your company. Not because of the article or what my father said or what she started again. I want to apologize because what I did was wrong. It was cruel, and it was stupid, and I did it because I thought it would be funny, and it wasn't funny, and I've been trying to figure out how to say that since Saturday night." Chris was quiet. "That's it," Alexis said. "That's all I called to say. You don't owe me anything. You don't have to forgive me or respond or—" "I hear you," Chris said. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. Softer. "Okay," she said. "It takes something to make that call," he said. "Same thing I told your father. He called you Monday morning." She was quiet for a moment. "He didn't tell me that." "No," Chris said. "I don't imagine he would." He paused. "You're 20 years old, Ms. Gold. You made a bad decision in a room full of pressure and the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no. That's a specific kind of trap, and it's hard to see the walls of it from inside." He paused again. "The fact that you can see them now matters." She didn't speak immediately. When she did, her voice was careful, stripped of the social gloss he'd heard at the gala. "My roommate said I had to become the person who tried or the person who didn't. I kept thinking about that. Smart roommate. She's annoying about it, but yes." A beat. Then, "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "When you walked out of that ballroom, were you scared? About the deal, about what it would cost you?" Chris thought about the steps of the Grand Meridian. The cool October air. The call to Mrs. Patterson, the sound of Emma's voice telling him she was asleep. "No," he said. Not about the deal. What were you scared of? That I'd stay, he said. She was quiet for a long moment. I think I understand that, she said finally. I'm not sure I've ever been scared of that, of staying somewhere I shouldn't be. She said it like a discovery, the particular tone of someone finding a word for something they hadn't had language for before. Most people aren't, Chris said, until they are. They talked for 11 more minutes. Not about business, not about the article, not about the cascading consequences that were still sorting themselves out across both their lives. They talked the way people talk when the performance layer has been stripped off, and what's left is just two people trying to say something true. He didn't offer reconciliation, and she didn't ask for it. By the time they ended the call, nothing had been resolved in any formal sense, and something had shifted in a way that didn't need to be named. He hung up and went back outside to where Emma was drawing on the porch with chalk. Was she nicer this time? Emma asked without looking up. Yeah, Chris said. She was. Emma nodded satisfied and went back to her drawing. The Pinnacle Health Systems deal came together faster than anything Chris had negotiated in 3 years. By the following Friday, 9 days after the gala, he was sitting in a conference room in Pinnacle's downtown Chicago office with their VP of Operations, a woman named Sandra Keyes, who had the direct, time-conscious energy of someone who'd spent 20 years not wasting anyone's minutes, including her own, and their general counsel, a quietly formidable man named Patrick Osei, who asked the kind of questions that told you immediately he'd done his reading. Ray was there. Marcus was there. Derek had the contract draft on his laptop. Sandra opened the meeting by sliding a single sheet of paper across the table. Chris looked at it, a preliminary term sheet, the numbers already filled in. He'd seen the figures before in the scoping calls, but seeing them on paper formal and real was a different experience. He looked up. This is a serious offer. We're serious people, Sandra said. We've been looking for the right cold chain partner for 14 months. We don't move fast as a rule, but when we see what we're looking for, we move. What made you move on us? Ray asked. Sandra looked at him. Then she looked at Chris. The article, she said, but not for the reason you might think. She leaned forward slightly. We operate in healthcare supply chain. You know what the #1 issue is in our industry: trust. Who can you trust to handle product that affects patient outcomes? Who can you trust when things go wrong, because things always go wrong, to handle it with integrity rather than deflection? She paused. What you did at that gala told me something about how you make decisions under pressure. That's not a public relations story. That's a character reference. Patrick spoke for the first time. We also called 3 of your current clients before reaching out, off the record, just to verify. And, Chris said, all 3 said essentially the same thing. Patrick opened his notebook. One of them said, and I'm quoting, Chris Miller is the only vendor I've ever had who called me personally when we had a problem before I even knew there was a problem. He closed the notebook. That's who we want handling our product. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. By the end of it, the term sheet had been marked up in 4 places, 3 of them Chris's requests and 1 of them Sandra's, and all 4 changes had been agreed to with less friction than most meetings spent on agendas. Patrick and Derek exchanged cards and agreed to talk contracts the following Monday. In the elevator going down, Ray stood next to Chris and stared at the doors and didn't say anything until the lobby. Then he said, bigger than Wexley. Yes, Chris said. Considerably bigger. Yes. Ray turned to look at him. You knew. I didn't know, Chris said. I believed. What's the difference? Knowing is certain. Believing costs something. He pushed through the lobby door into the cold November air. If I'd known it would work out, walking out of that ballroom would have been easy. It wasn't easy. Ray pulled his coat closed. It looked easy. That's different, Chris said. That's just practice. The story by the time it reached its third week had grown in the way that true stories grow when they catch on, not distorted exactly, but amplified the essential truth of it intact, while the surrounding details accumulated weight. There were podcasts now. Two separate business publications had run longer pieces, both framed around what they called the new calculus of professional integrity. A segment on a Chicago morning radio show had spent 20 minutes on it, and the host, a 60-year-old man named Don Richter, who had the veteran broadcaster's gift for talking about human things in human ways, had said something that got clipped and shared widely. What Chris Miller did wasn't brave because it cost him money. It was brave because he did it without knowing what it would cost. That's the only kind of brave that counts. Chris heard the clip from Tom Greer, who sent it to him in a text message with no comment, just the audio file. He listened to it once at his desk early on a Tuesday morning before anyone else came in. Then he closed his phone and went to review the Memphis facility projections. He was not comfortable with the attention. That was the honest truth that he hadn't said to anyone except Tom in a 10-minute call Thursday evening that had started about board logistics and drifted as conversations with Tom sometimes did into territory that was harder to map. "You doing okay with all this?" Tom had asked. "Define okay." The attention, the calls, the whatever this is turning into. Chris had leaned back in his chair, the office quiet around him, the city starting to go dark outside his window. "I walked out of that ballroom," he said, "because it was the right thing to do for my company and for my own sense of who I am. I didn't walk out of it to become a story." "I know," Tom said. "And now I'm a story, and people are drawing conclusions from the story that may or may not have anything to do with the actual moment." He paused. "There was cake on my face, Tom. I was tired. I was thinking about Emma. It wasn't a heroic moment. It was just a moment where I knew what I was and what I wasn't, and the two things didn't match what staying would have required." Tom was quiet for a moment. "You know what your father used to say about moments like that?" "Tell me." "He used to say that the difference between a man with character and a man who performs character is that the man with character has no idea he's being watched." Tom paused. "He'd be proud of you, Chris." Chris didn't say anything for a moment. The city outside his window continued its business, the ordinary, indifferent movement of a million people getting through their days. "Thanks, Tom," he said finally. "Get some sleep." "You too." Theodore Wexley called again on a Thursday 3 weeks after the gala. Chris was in his car, leaving Emma's school after dropping her off the morning routine they'd established years ago. The same route, the same timing, the particular ritual of ordinary life that he protected the way other people protected financial assets. He answered through the car's speaker. "Theodore." "Chris, I hope I'm not—" "It's fine. I'm in the car." "Good." A pause. "I'll be brief. I'm calling to tell you something, not to ask for anything. I want to be clear about that first." "Go ahead." "I restructured Alexis's role at the foundation," Wexley said. "She's no longer in an advisory position. I've enrolled her in a formal business management program at Northwestern part-time, structured with a mentor who has no connection to our company or our name. Someone who will not accommodate her the way our organization has." He paused. "That's not a punishment. It's an investment. But it required me to be honest with both of us about what I'd been allowing." Chris kept his eyes on the road. "How did she take it?" "Better than I expected. Worse than I hoped." A short, wry exhale, the sound of a father navigating something fathers don't get a manual for. "She told me she'd already spoken with you." "She did." "She didn't tell me what you said, just that you'd called her back." He paused. "Thank you for that." "She made the effort first," Chris said. "That counted." A silence. Wexley said, "I'm not going to ask about the agreement. That's not why I called." "I know. But I want you to know that the door is open, on our side, whenever and however makes sense on yours, or never if that's the outcome. I'll respect it either way." Chris drove for a moment without speaking. The morning was gray, the kind of flat November light that made everything look like it was waiting. He thought about Sandra Keyes sliding the term sheet across the table. He thought about Tom's voice saying he'd be proud of you. He thought about Emma reading the back of a cereal box. "I'll tell you what I told your daughter," Chris said. "Nothing's permanently closed. What happens from here tells the story." He paused. "You made changes. That's not nothing." "No," Wexley said quietly. "It's not nothing." Another pause. "Take care of yourself, Chris." "You too, Theodore." He ended the call and drove the rest of the way to the office in silence, thinking about the particular way accountability moves through people slowly, imperfectly, in fits and starts, not like a river flowing toward something, but more like water finding its way through packed earth, uncertain of the path until it finds one. It was Ray who told him about the employee meeting request. He appeared in Chris's doorway Friday afternoon, the end of the third week, holding a sheet of paper and wearing an expression that Chris had learned to recognize as the one Ray used when something had happened that he hadn't anticipated and didn't have a prepared position on. "Your team wants to meet with you," Ray said. Chris looked up from the Memphis projections. "Which team?" "All of them." Ray came in, put the paper on the desk. "They organized it themselves. No management involvement. I want to be clear about that because I know how it sounds, and it's not a complaint situation. Marcus told me this morning." He paused. "They want to talk to you about what happened at the gala." Chris looked at the paper. It was a sign-up sheet, handwritten the old-fashioned kind with names in different handwriting filling in time slots for a Friday afternoon meeting. He recognized names from every department: logistics, legal, finance, operations, the Memphis facility planning team, the two women from HR who had been with the company since year 3, Carlos from the loading dock crew who had 12 years in, and whose opinion Chris had trusted since a snowstorm in January of the company's 5th year, when Carlos had made a call that saved $40,000 of product and never mentioned it afterward. There were 61 names on the sheet. Chris counted them twice. "What time?" he said. 4 o'clock, Ray said. "Conference room A." Though honestly, he glanced at the list. "We might need the larger space." At 4 o'clock, Chris walked into conference room A and found that they'd needed the larger space and moved there, and that somehow even the larger space felt close, because 61 people fill a room in a way that isn't just about numbers. They fill it with something that doesn't have a precise name, some combination of attention and investment, and the particular quality of people who've decided that something matters enough to show up for it. He stood at the front of the room and looked at them. He didn't have notes. He hadn't prepared a speech. He didn't think this was a speech situation. "I heard you wanted to talk," he said. A woman in the third row. Janet from finance, 54 years old, 15 years with the company. The person who'd been with them through 2 recessions and a pandemic and had never once asked for public recognition raised her hand. "We didn't want to talk," she said. "We wanted to say something. There's a difference." He nodded. "Go ahead, Janet." She stood up, which surprised him because Janet was not by disposition a standing-up kind of person. She was a sitting down, getting the work done, being right without announcing it kind of person. Which made the standing matter more. "We've worked for this company for a long time, most of us," she said. "Some of us for a long time. And you've never not once done anything in a meeting or on a call or in this building that made us feel like what we do here is just transactions." She paused. "What you did at that gala, the way you handled it, we needed you to know that we saw it. That it mattered to us. Not the business side of it. Not the article." She looked directly at him. "That you're the kind of person we thought you were." The room was quiet. Carlos in the back said without standing what she said. And then, because the room was full of people who worked with their hands and their minds and didn't much go in for ceremony, it wasn't applause exactly, more like a collective exhale. The sound of 61 people releasing something they'd been holding for 3 weeks. A sound that was both quieter and heavier than applause, and meant more than applause would have. Chris stood at the front of the room and looked at the people who had built this company alongside him, year by year, warehouse by warehouse, client by client. And he felt something move through his chest that he didn't have immediate language for. He thought about the leased warehouse in Dayton. 11 employees. 1 client. A man of 26 with a business plan and his father's work ethic, and a certainty that the way you treated people was the only real business strategy that compounded over time. 240 people now. The Pinnacle deal. The Memphis facility. 3 inbound calls from clients who'd read 4 sentences in a newspaper and decided that was who they wanted to trust with their supply chain. He cleared his throat. "I need you all to know something," he said. "Whatever happened 3 weeks ago at that event, whatever story is being told about it, the version that matters is what happens in this building. Every day. What you all do here." He looked around the room. "I walked out of that ballroom because I knew who I was. I know who I am because of what we've built here. Together." He paused. "That's the whole story. Everything else is just noise." Janet sat back down. Carlos nodded once from the back. And that was enough. That was the whole of it. No ceremony, no lingering, no performance. Just 61 people and 1 man in a room where something true had been said and said back and understood. The meeting ended at 4:22. Chris walked back to his office, sat down at his desk, and picked up the Memphis projections where he'd left off. The numbers were the same as they'd been an hour ago. The work was the same. The city outside his window was doing what it always did, which was going forward indifferent and continuous. But something had settled in him, some last remaining piece of the weight he'd been carrying since he wiped frosting off his face and stood up straight in a room full of people who thought they'd broken him. It set down quietly without drama, the way things set down when they're finally in the right place. He picked up his pen. He went back to work. The Memphis facility broke ground on a Tuesday in December, 6 weeks after the gala. It was cold, the particular dry cold of the Mid-South in early winter, the kind that didn't have the wet bite of Chicago, but made itself known anyway, and the ground was hard under the ceremonial shovels, and Chris had to lean into it more than the photographs would suggest. Ray was beside him. Marcus. Derek. Sandra Keyes from Pinnacle, who had driven down from Chicago that morning and shaken hands with everyone and said, looking out at the cleared land, "This is going to be something." She was right. It was going to be something. 80,000 square feet, state-of-the-art temperature control across 4 distinct cold zones, 62 new jobs, most of them full-time, with benefits, the hiring already underway, in partnership with 2 local workforce development organizations that Chris had called personally, and whose directors he'd had lunch with 3 weeks earlier at a diner on Poplar Avenue that served the best catfish he'd ever eaten. He'd told Emma about it that morning over breakfast. She'd been more interested in the catfish than the facility, which felt right. "Will it have a name?" she'd asked. "Buildings usually do," he said. "We haven't decided yet." She'd thought about it with the concentrated seriousness she brought to important questions. "You should name it after something that matters," she said. "What matters?" he asked. She looked at him like the answer was obvious. "People," she said. "Name it after people." He'd looked at her across the breakfast table and thought about a leased warehouse in Dayton and a woman named Sarah who used to tilt her head when she was thinking, and a 7-year-old with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and he thought that he had, without fully planning it, built everything that mattered out of exactly that, out of people. The ones who stayed, and the ones who were gone, and the ones who were still becoming who they were going to be. "Yeah," he'd said. "That's a good idea." She'd nodded satisfied and gone back to her cereal. Tom Greer drove down for the groundbreaking and stayed for lunch afterward at the same diner, and they sat across from each other in a red vinyl booth, while the December light came through the window and made everything look a little warmer than it was. And Tom ordered coffee and looked at Chris across the table, the way he'd looked at him at a kitchen table years ago, in the weeks after Sarah died, not trying to fix anything, just present. "How do you feel?" Tom asked. "Good," Chris said. "Genuinely good." Not nervous about the scale. Nervous and good aren't mutually exclusive. Tom smiled. No, they're not. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. The board approved the Memphis capital allocation this morning. Unanimous. He paused. Including aldermen. What changed his mind? The Pinnacle contract changed his mind. Sandra Keyes apparently called him directly. Off her own initiative, not ours. Tom shook his head slowly. Told him she'd been trying to find a cold chain partner she could trust for 14 months, and that one newspaper article told her more about your organization than 14 months of vendor reviews. He looked at Chris. You understand that you can't manufacture that, right? What she did, what that meant, that's not a PR strategy. That's consequence. I know, Chris said. The consequence of being who you are. Tom said consistently enough that people can count on it. He picked up his coffee. Your father understood that. It took him 20 years to teach it to me, and I'm not sure I've ever operated at the level he did, but I recognize it when I see it. Chris looked out the window at the street, the ordinary midday movement of a city going about its business truck deliveries and lunch traffic, and a woman pushing a stroller past a hardware store with a handwritten sign in the window. He wasn't perfect, Chris said. My father. No, nobody worth talking about is. He made mistakes. There were years when work came first in ways it shouldn't have. He knew it. He tried to correct it. He paused. I think about that sometimes. The correcting. The trying. He looked back at Tom. I want Emma to remember the trying as much as she remembers the mistakes. I hope she does. She will, Tom said, because you're making it possible for her to. He set down his cup. That's the whole job, Chris. That's all any of us are really doing, making it possible for the people after us to be better than we were. They ate lunch. They talked about the facility timeline, the hiring schedule, the logistics of the Pinnacle rollout in Q1. They talked about Tom's retirement garden and whether tomatoes were worth the effort, and Tom maintained firmly that they were not, and Chris maintained that they absolutely were, and nothing was resolved. They left a 22% tip because the waitress had been working since 5 in the morning and had told them so without complaint, and because it was the kind of thing you did when you had the means and the sense to match them. Outside in the parking lot, Tom put his hand on Chris's shoulder briefly. The gesture of a man from a generation that didn't say certain things out loud, but found other ways to say them, and then got in his car and drove back toward Chicago. Chris stood in the parking lot for a moment. The cold air, the flat winter sky, the weight of what was being built 40 minutes away in a field that had been cleared and measured and would become by next November 62 people's livelihood. He thought it was the best day he'd had in a long time. Then he got in his car and drove back to the site. Alexis Gold started at Northwestern in January. She'd told Jules the night before her first session, sitting at the kitchen table in the Lincoln Park apartment with her laptop and her notebook and the expression of someone standing at a door, they're not entirely sure they want to open, that she was not going to be good at this. You don't know that, Jules said. I've never been in a room where I wasn't the most confident person, Alexis said, and I'm beginning to understand that confidence and competence are not the same thing. That's actually a very competent observation. Don't do the wise thing. I'm not. I'm serious. Jules sat down across from her. You know what the difference is between you 3 months ago and you right now. Alexis looked at her. 3 months ago you didn't know that. You do now. Jules shrugged. That's not nothing. That's actually significant. The mentor her father had arranged was a woman named Dr. Caroline Marsh, 60 years old, a former COO of a regional hospital system, now teaching business ethics at Northwestern and consulting with 2 nonprofit boards. She had no interest in the Wexley name, no patience for performance, and a way of asking questions that made Alexis feel in the first session simultaneously more seen and more uncomfortable than she'd been in years. Tell me what you want to build, Dr. Marsh said at the end of the first meeting. Alexis had started to say something about the foundation, about social media strategy, about the work she'd been doing before her father restructured her role. Then she'd stopped because Dr. Marsh was looking at her with the expression of someone who was waiting for the real answer and was entirely willing to wait. "I don't know yet," Alexis said. "Good," Dr. Marsh said. "That's the right answer. The people who walk in here knowing exactly what they want to build are usually describing what someone else wanted for them." She closed her notebook. "Come back next week. Think between now and then about what you're actually good at. Not what you've been told you're good at. What you know in your own body that you're genuinely capable of." Alexis thought about it all week. She thought about the article, about Chris Miller's voice at the microphone, unhurried, clear, the voice of someone who'd already done the internal work before the external moment arrived. She'd read the Priya Anand piece 4 times total, not the comments, just the article, and each time the paragraph that stopped her was the one about a man who'd started with 11 employees in a leased warehouse. 26 years old. Nothing but a plan and the willingness to carry it. She'd never started anything. That was what she came back to every time. She'd been placed into things: the foundation's advisory board, the social media role, the charitable committees that bore the Wexley name, but she'd never started anything from a position of nothing and built it into something. She'd never had to. And the people who actually had, not performatively, not with a family name as ballast, they moved through the world differently. She'd seen it. She'd felt it at close range, on the receiving end of it, in a ballroom on a Saturday night, when a man wiped frosting off his face and stood up and did the thing she'd spent the past 3 months trying to understand. She went back to Dr. Marsh the following week and said, "I want to learn how to start something." Dr. Marsh had looked at her for a moment. Then she'd smiled, small, real, nothing performative about it. "Now we can work," she said. Chris found out about Alexis's enrollment through Theodore in a brief phone call in late January that had the easy, unforced quality of conversations between people who've moved past the difficult part and are figuring out what comes next. "She's taking it seriously," Wexley said. "More than I expected. More than she expected, I think." "Dr. Marsh will do that to you," Chris said. A pause. "You know Caroline? She was on our advisory board during year 2. She's the one who told me I was undercharging for our services by 30% and that my pricing model reflected my self-worth, not my product's value." He paused. "She was right." Wexley laughed, a genuine sound, unguarded. "Well, Alexis is in good hands then." He was quiet for a moment. "She mentioned she called you last fall." "She did. She said you were—" He paused, choosing kind. "That you were kinder than she had any right to expect." "She made the call," Chris said. "That was the hard part. For her, yes. It was." Another pause, carrying something heavier. "I want you to know, and I don't say this as a business statement. I say it as a father. Watching her navigate these past few months has been one of the harder and more important things I've experienced in a long time. She's changing, not because I asked her to, because she decided to." His voice shifted slightly lower, less composed. "I don't know that I would have had that kind of honesty with myself at 20. I'm not sure I had it at 40. He stopped. "Whatever part your decision that night played in setting that in motion, I'm grateful for it. Privately. As a man." Chris was quiet for a moment. "Take care of her, Theodore." "I'm trying," Wexley said. "I'm really trying." The Pinnacle rollout launched in March, and by April, it was operating at 112% of projected capacity. Sandra Keyes sent Chris a one-line email that said, "You were right about Memphis. We weren't thinking big enough." He replied with 3 words, "Let's go bigger." She replied with a meeting request for the following week. The Memphis facility was framed by June. Chris drove down with Emma during her spring break, the 2 of them making a road trip of it, 2 days down, 2 days back, stopping at places Emma chose from a list she'd made by reading 3 different travel blogs, with the same concentration she gave cereal boxes. They ate barbecue in 3 states. Emma decided Tennessee's was the best and was prepared to defend this position at length. They stood outside the facility site on a Tuesday afternoon, the steel framing reaching into a blue sky June day, and Emma looked up at it for a long time without speaking. "It's big," she said finally. "It's going to be bigger," Chris said. "How many people are going to work here?" 62 to start, more after the first year." She thought about that. 62 families, she said. He looked down at her. "What? That's 62 families," she said, in the matter-of-fact way she said things that turned out to be profound. 62 people who have jobs, so 62 families that have money for groceries and rent and stuff. She looked up at the frame. "That's a lot of people." He stood beside his daughter in the June sun and looked at the steel bones of what they were building and thought about the word consequence. Tom's word, the way he'd used it at the diner. The consequence of being who you are consistently enough that people can count on it. This was consequence. 62 families, the pinnacle products moving through temperature-controlled corridors to hospitals and clinics across the Midwest. Sandra Keyes already talking about a second facility in Kansas City. Ray fielding 4 new inbound calls a week from organizations who'd read the story and wanted to talk. All of it downstream from one October night when a man had wiped his face clean and walked to a microphone and said what was true, and then walked out into the night air and called to check on his daughter. He put his arm around Emma's shoulders, and she leaned into him the way she did easily, automatically. The particular lean of someone who has never once questioned whether the thing they're leaning on will hold. "Yeah, baby," he said. "It's a lot of people." The facility opened in November, exactly 13 months after the gala. Chris had thought when they were planning the opening event that he wanted something simple. No gala, no black tie, no gold-embossed invitations. A lunch the good kind, the kind with real food that people actually ate in the facility's new break room, with folding tables, and the whole staff and their families invited, and a few remarks that he kept to 4 minutes, because anything beyond 4 minutes was either a speech or an apology, and he didn't need to make either. Janet from finance came down with her husband. Carlos drove with his wife and 2 kids, who immediately became fascinated by the refrigerated loading dock, and had to be gently redirected. Ray was there, and Marcus and Derek and Kara, and 61 other people who'd put their names on a sign-up sheet in a conference room 8 months ago to tell their boss they saw him. Sandra Keyes came. She brought Patrick Ossie and 2 members of the Pinnacle operations team, and she stood in the new facility's main corridor and looked up at the ceiling and said quietly, "This is exactly what we needed." And she meant it about more than the building. Tom Greer came. He shook Chris's hand for a long time without saying anything, and then he said, "Your father would have found something wrong with the drainage specs and then been proud of you anyway." And Chris laughed the real laugh, the one that started in his chest. Emma was there in her best dress, the navy one she'd chosen herself, and she spent most of the lunch with Carlos's kids, and a clipboard she'd found somewhere conducting what she described as an official inspection, the results of which she planned to deliver in a written report. And Theodore Wexley came. He arrived quietly without announcement in a dark coat rather than a tuxedo, and he found Chris near the end of the lunch and shook his hand with both of his, the grip of a man who meant what the gesture was saying. "Congratulations," Wexley said. "Thank you for coming, Theodore." "I wanted to." He looked around the facility, the staff moving through it with the ease of people who already knew where they belonged. The families at the folding tables, the laughter of Carlos's kids somewhere in the background. "This is something," he said. "This is genuinely something." "It is," Chris agreed. Wexley looked at him for a moment. "I want you to know the door is still open, on our end, whenever the time is right. No pressure, no timeline." He paused. "I'm a more patient man than I was 13 months ago. Alexis helped me understand that patience is not the same as waiting. It's working while you wait. Chris looked at him. She said that last week, at dinner. Wexley smiled the real kind, the one that had nothing to do with rooms or power or the performance of authority. She's not the same person, and honestly, he glanced at the floor briefly, the gesture of a man doing a private accounting. Neither am I. Good, Chris said. It was the simplest true thing he could say. Wexley nodded. He looked around one more time, taking in the room the 62 people, the families. The evidence of what careful and principled work built when it was allowed to compound over time. Then he put his hands in his coat pockets and said, "I'll leave you to your people." And Chris walked him to the door, and they shook hands again in the doorway. And the November air came in, cold and clean, and Wexley walked to his car, and Chris watched him go, and felt no bitterness, no triumph, nothing that required a name more complicated than peace. He went back inside. Emma appeared at his elbow, clipboard in hand, official expression in place. "I have my report," she announced. "Let's hear it." She consulted the clipboard. The break room has good chairs. The loading dock is very large and very cold. The hallways are long enough to run in, but I didn't because it's a professional environment. She looked up. Also, the people here are nice. They kept telling me my dad is good. I told them I know. He looked at her navy dress clipboard. Sarah's eyes holding his with complete and total certainty. And something moved through him that wasn't happiness exactly, because happiness was too small a word for something that occupied this much space. It was more like the feeling of a completed thing. Not finished, it would never be finished. That was the nature of what he'd built, but completed in the sense that it had become what it was always trying to become, and that the becoming had been worth every version of the cost. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah," she said simply. "I know." He took the clipboard from her gently and tucked it under his arm and put his other arm around her shoulders, and they walked back into the facility together, into the warmth and the noise, and the ordinary, extraordinary evidence of 62 lives that were different because of a choice made on a Tuesday night in October with frosting on his face and not one single doubt about who he was. Some men built empires to prove their worth to the world. Chris Miller had done something harder. He'd simply refused to betray it in the one moment that would have been easiest to do so, and the world had rearranged itself around that refusal in ways that no spreadsheet could have projected, and no board could have approved, and no gala invitation could have promised. He had walked out of that ballroom, a man with a company and a daughter, and a star-shaped nightlight burning in a hallway window. He walked into this facility as the same man, exactly precisely the same man, and that was not in spite of everything that had happened, but because of it, because the world had tested the thing he was made of, and it had held, and holding was the only proof that ever mattered. That was who he was. That was what he'd built. And nobody, not Alexis Gold with a cake in her hands, not a ballroom full of witnesses, not $800 million sitting on a table, nobody had ever been able to take that from him. Because it was never for sale.